Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Meet the Candidates video interview series where we are interviewing candidates in local elections for City Council, as well as citywide elections, mayor, comptroller, and public advocate. Today, we are interviewing Ms. Latchmi Gopal, who is running for City Council in District 15. For our District 15 voters, please be advised that there is a special election for District 15 to replace former City Councilman Richie Torres, who is now Congressman Richie Torres. So on March 23rd, you do have a special election. You can do early voting, meaning vote a week before the special election. You can go onto the Board of Elections website for the early voting site information. And you can also go on the Board of Elections website to request an absentee ballot. So we're going to get started with our interview, and I would like to welcome Ms. Gopal. We are honored to have you today with us here at LittleAfrica BronxNews. Please tell our viewers about yourself.
Thank you so much for taking the time today, Mona. Really excited to be in this conversation and with the Little Africa community to talk about the special election that you just described. So my name is Latchmi Gopal. I'm a Bronx native, born and raised in the Soundview area of the Bronx, and moved to District 15, specifically in the Belmont area when I was 13. Have been living with my family, my brother, my mom, and my dad here in the district for over 15 years. And I, again, born and raised in the Bronx, and I am a first-generation American. So my family is Guyanese, Caribbean, and they migrated here. My parents migrated in the 80s. And that is a very big part of my politic, is how do we show up collectively and show up for our community, and taking all of those learned lessons from my Guyanese community and my Guyanese family and bring that to Bronx politics. I have been doing national and local advocacy work for years, mostly rooted in economic justice work. Some of the things I've worked on has been raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, helping to pass automatic voter registration, which helps places specifically like the Bronx, where there is a low voter engagement and low voter turnout and civic engagement. And so it just creates another opportunity for folks to actually be involved and show up to things like the special election in District 15. I love the Bronx. I am so dedicated to not only my family that's here, but having future kids here. My partner is a public school education teacher, and so thinking through the ways that we can really have better accountability for City Council, and how we can have better accountability for our communities when we think through what budgets will look like, how we think through safety nets and surviving and getting past the impact of COVID in our communities. I'm just really dedicated to how we can have better systems that really help Bronxites thrive and not just be in a state of depletion, which I think a lot of our community, and when we get into the conversation more, we could talk about the nuances there, but we've just been in a state of depletion for so long due to a lack of legitimate investment to help us be in a better place. And I'm just very, very excited to be running for City Council in my home, in a place that has raised me, and looking for ways to give back.
Okay, wow. So Ms. Gopal, you have your special election on March 23rd. So if elected as City Councilwoman, that means March 24th is day one. So unlike candidates in other races who have just the Democratic primary on June 22nd, and if they win that, then it's the general. And of course, if they win that, then they start January 1st. If you win your special election, your day one is March 24th. So my question to you is, as a City Councilwoman, March 24th, what are your top 3 priorities for your district? What is your COVID-19 recovery plan to help and support the families in your district, as well as the small businesses in your district?
I really appreciate this question, and that's a great distinguisher between the special election and the primaries that are happening with close to 300 folks, I think even more than that, running for City Council. And so you're right, on day one, March 24th will be a time where we'll have as a city councilwoman, will have access to the city budget, will be able to allocate and really push and advocate for what communities need, and really build with communities right here. And by listening to what folks have already been saying about what they need and what their COVID relief plan looks like. And so there's a couple of limitations, and I think it's really important to be transparent in what's possible in elected office and what's possible during your trajectory of being in elected office. And so as much as, yes, March 24th will be day one, a lot of the budget will already have been determined. So instead of actually being able to sit through legislative conversations and committee discussions as to where things can actually go, it's really going to be holding those budget lines accountable for things along the lines of COVID relief. And so some of the things that I would do on day one, specifically recognizing the impact that COVID has had on District 15 residents that are majority Black, brown, working class immigrant residents, is these three things. One, we need to make sure that there is a pathway and a pipeline for affordable and permanent housing that is happening immediate. Right now, we have eviction moratoriums, and we have movements and campaigns that are set up around canceling rent, but we need to, on day one, make sure that folks know that there is a plan and that there's going to be investment in sustained affordable housing that is helping not only maintain the housing that folks have, but looking to also put in direct resources for our unhoused population that in specifically District 15 has been growing astronomically. Our shelters are at capacity. COVID has made it very difficult to actually be able to utilize those spaces well. So getting creative and thinking through contracts, specifically looking at places like the Lambert Hotel in the Upper East Side that has shifted over to be a place of temporary housing for our unhoused population, and actually working with folks and using that model and thinking of how we can actually do that in District 15. There's space for folks, and how do we actually work to make sure that people have shelter, especially with COVID and in the middle of winter, because on March 24th, it will be cold. It will 100% be cold. And so thinking about that. Secondly, there needs to be a really big push in immediate healthcare access and public education around access to not only testing sites that continuously change, but the rollout of vaccines. And so utilizing the city council office, and as a city councilwoman, making sure that we are doing public education campaigns and reaching residents and voters where they're at, as far as how they're going to have access to vaccines, what it looks like to be safe and preventative, not only through the usage of PPE, but we need to depend on our healthcare system and healthcare access during this time. I look to organizations like Bronx Rising that has really been leaning into making sure that vaccine knowledge and vaccines are reaching folks. I think about people who are sheltered in place right now, either due to an autoimmune disease, reducing their exposure to COVID, or age, or being differently abled if they have a disability, whatever it may be. This usually falls on our elderly community. It falls on our disabled community, and we cannot rely on the ability to get to Yankee Stadium, which is great and wonderful, to be the only way that they're receiving vaccines. It needs to be at their doors, in their lobbies, at healthcare centers that are around the block, pharmacies that they're familiar with. This is what needs to be happening. And then the third thing I would really look to do is, there is immense food insecurity in the Bronx. We have the Bronx Mutual Aid Network that has really leaned in and filled the gap that government should be filling. So when you look at mutual aid groups and all the praise around pantries and access to food that is filling a short-term need, it's wonderful, and I think a testament to community and how the Bronx shows up for each other, but really shows us the gap, the lack of a safety net for food, accessible food, not only for sustenance, but also for health. When we look at the death rates in the Bronx in relation to COVID, a lot of it is due to predetermining factors of inadequate ability to fight off this virus, inadequate access to healthy foods, when we think about antioxidants, all of these things, or even the asthma rates in the Bronx specifically, which are astronomically higher than anywhere else in New York City. All of these things are connected to our health, and they're all essential to our immediate and long-term COVID plan. COVID is not going away as soon as these vaccines are rolled out. It's going to take time. And our systems, our economic ones, our social ones are going to continue to receive the brunt of the lack of investment that we've seen in the Bronx overall. And I'm really determined to use that March 24th date to hold budget and hold city officials, city agencies, and working with the federal representatives as well to really be looking at how we can work together to make sure that Bronxites get what they need to survive this and be in a position to actually thrive. And you had also mentioned small businesses. Yes, so for small businesses, you know, in District 15, we have Little Italy, we have Fordham, we have, we're up against East Tremont. There's so many small businesses. And the unique thing about the small businesses here in the Bronx specifically, and in District 15 is that we actually have the employees and the owners living in the district, living in the community, being part of the community. So not only will, you know, what I talked about as far as affordable housing or healthcare access are going to directly impact businesses because they impact the people who own them and who work for them. But also we have to think about how do we sustain small businesses, which are the backbone of our local economy, and actually create so much upward mobility and the quote unquote American dream for so many of the folks who live in the district. And so when I think about small business investment that needs to happen in the immediate, there needs to be grants. There needs to be an access grants that allow for immediate influx of funds to help them keep their doors open, potentially pay employees. I believe that only 2% of the PPE loans that went out were received by small businesses in the Bronx. Yeah, so it's only 2%, and that happened for a couple of reasons. I think one, again, we have a lack of public information campaigns that happen in the Bronx. Bronxites are not receiving the information, they're not receiving the guidance that they need to do the things that they want to do and do the things that are needed to sustain us. And so people were not receiving help with applications. People were not receiving guidance in any of that. And so making sure that we are connecting small businesses directly to the resources that are available, like these PPE loans, pushing for grants in the immediate so that they don't have to worry about immediately paying back the government for whatever was given to them. And then also looking into tax subsidies or long-term leases that could be tax subsidies that are dependent on long-term leases that folks can utilize, where it's sort of beneficial on both ends. You have a commitment to stay in that space, and then you also have a break in what your upfront cost is. There's many things that can be done to make sure that small businesses are actually invested in, and that we continue to sustain the local economy that is so integral to the Bronx and to Bronxites in District 15.
Yeah, I think that you touched on a very important point when you talk about small businesses driving the economy. It's small businesses that are the engine for the national economy as well as for the local economy. And these small businesses employ our community members, they employ our neighbors. And the fact that the Bronx only received 2% of the PPP funding as well as other stimulus funds, I mean, that is completely unacceptable. Somebody dropped the ball, whether it's the Bronx Overall Economic Development Corporation, the Bronx Chamber of Commerce, whoever it is, there should have been support for these small businesses to help them and guide them through the process of applying for the funding, and also, gathering whatever paperwork that they needed to submit. So it's really unfortunate, and I hope that the powers that be will do more to support small businesses, because this pandemic is not going away, and the consequences, the ripple effect of this pandemic is going to be felt for a long time. So I want to talk to you about healthcare, which you touched on, and the vaccine rollout. Yes, it is great that Yankee Stadium is is a mega site. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. But the Bronx is big. Yankee Stadium is on that side of the Bronx. For me, I'm in Co-op City. Yankee Stadium is way, way, way on that side. And even for residents in your district as well. But we've been hearing stories. There was a New York Times article and the City.NYC article about folks in Washington Heights who couldn't get vaccinated at the site there because people from Westchester were coming in. The same thing has happened, for example, in Co-op City. Our seniors couldn't get vaccinated because people from Long Island came in and they were being vaccinated. So there's clearly a problem here. And considering that the Bronx is ground zero for essential workers, our essential workers, our elderly, our at-risk community members should have been first in the line. So my question to you is, how would you, and you touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little bit more, how would you remedy this? How would you rectify this situation to ensure that your District 15 constituents and all Bronx sites, ground zero, are first in line or in the front of the line to get this vaccine? What type of rollout would you do if the governor and the mayor says, Ms. Gopal, give us the plan?
I really appreciate that. I think just to expand on what you're saying around access, and I think describing the Bronx as ground zero is actually so reflective of so many of our broken systems and how we've been impacted disproportionately around it. There was data that came out a few weeks ago that really not only described specifically in the Bronx, how like other folks were able to get access to Bronx specific appointments, but that they did a demographic breakdown as to who was actually able to get access. Not only if they're not essential workers or they don't qualify, but also race is a part of this, demographic is a part of this. And so we're also seeing that predominantly Black and brown folks are having the least amount of access, yet the most amount of impact that is deathly when it comes to COVID exposure. And I touched upon this a little bit before, but our predetermined health conditions are a big signifier and also are a testament to broken systems, but they're showing up in how COVID is impacting us in the immediate. And so if I was asked what the plan should be, I really think it needs to be kind of rooted in this idea of meeting people where they're at and and also having direct investment of the vaccine rollout. So of course there's monetary investment that's been put towards it. But I think one aspect of this, and I've mentioned this before in regards to other things, is there needs to be an investment in a public information campaign. And there needs to be investment in coordination with other organizations, nonprofit, grassroots organizations, coalitions that already exist, as well as community health centers. Like you said, Yankee Stadium is far. It's nowhere near my district. The fastest way you can get there is probably the D train over in Kingsbridge, Fordham, and even that, like that also puts someone at risk. Like if they're already, you're a co-op, so it's a whole other issue. But even that, it's increasing exposure to get access to something that is supposed to ultimately help us survive this, right? And so that doesn't make sense. It's very backwards. It's not enough. I think what we're doing is you're seeing a fairly conservative rollout of this vaccine as far as its legitimate access to the people it's directly impacting. And so I think about like Leroy Pharmacy that's on Bainbridge and how that could be it's a local pharmacy. People are familiar with it. There's some space. You can set up out front and sidewalks on days that are cold, but if it's dry and we're able to implement it, as long as the temperature of the vaccine the integrity of that can be upheld, we can think through what that looks like. But there's community health centers, there's pharmacies, there's even looking at, like, for instance, the Armory. There are different different facilities and different physical spaces throughout our district and throughout the Bronx that need to be utilized better in order to give people these vaccines. And then I had mentioned Bronx Rising, having them in lobbies of of like our buildings, right? Like we have, you think of NYCHA buildings, you think of affordable housing buildings. These are buildings where a majority of the residents are sheltering in place, are predominantly Black, brown, immigrant working class, are essential workers, our teachers, our nurses are doing all these things, and they need to also be reached where they're at. And so rolling this out again has to be direct investment and has to be reaching people where they're at. And that public information campaign, why are we, essential workers are taking public transit. Is there enough information? Are there advertisements being utilized at train stations, on buses? I think about, I sit on a train and I'm reading the things around me. Is there language justice? Are we leaning into language justice that is necessary for these public campaigns? Are people getting information in Mandarin, in French, in Spanish? I think about in our district specifically, we have Little Yemen, we have a large West African population. Are they being reached? No. And that is going to cause, and we've already seen a hike in COVID cases and a lack of access to vaccines. And it is the responsibility of the city government and government as a whole to not only do the connecting of health services, but also to do the direct communicating and translating as to the necessity of community and herd immunity, and the necessity of the vaccine, and why we should be doing this in the first place, and why it's important for us as individuals and as a community. And I think it really falls into that public information campaign. You see a lack of it when it comes to the special election on March 23rd, and you see it when it comes to healthcare. It's not happening.
Mhm. No, I think you're absolutely right. And imagine if if there are various NYCHA community centers, every community center could be set up as a COVID vaccine location. Every pharmacy could, just as how they give out the flu shots, these pharmacies should also be able to give out the COVID vaccine shots.
Yeah. And I also think about, one thing I'll add is that we've seen an uptake in food pantry distribution and mutual aid efforts that have been happening across the Bronx to really um, try to chip away at the lack of food access doesn't happen for Bronxites overall. But those we could take a look at the contracts. Where's food pantry going? What days are they going? Can we set up vaccines? People are already familiar that on Thursdays, I do a lot of work with the community center, Miss Abby's kids over on Webster Avenue. They have pantry every other Thursday and Saturday. That is something that happens already. Wouldn't that be a great place? And they have the space for it. They have the familiarity. They have the trust of the community as being a place of resource. And, there's language justice there as well, and accessibility. That is a great place to do this. And it's on Webster Avenue in the middle of Fordham, which has an astronomical unemployed, unhoused, and impacted community. That is where we need to be going with these. Yankee Stadium is amazing and great because it's large, but it's also, there's an aspect of that is sort of lazy.
Yeah.
It's easy. It's easy to do it there.
Everybody just come to us.
Yeah. And no, you have to reach people where they're at. And if we don't start to shift the way in which we allocate resources to be in that vein, then we're going to continue to see a lack of safety nets. We're going to continue to see an uptake in neglect and death, ultimately, without the access of this. We need to be reaching people where they're at. Knock doors. Like in a safe way, PPE, we think about how that gets information to people. Show up and work with tenant leaders, tenant organizers, housing leaders that already have established trust. Because the other thing that I sort of alluded to already is we have to be in a relationship that is built in trust and transparency with residents. And that is not happening with this. People are confused. People are scared. People don't know enough about it, and they are hesitant, rightfully so, because we're not doing enough and we need to be doing more.
Yeah, absolutely. They really do need to be doing much, much more. So I want to talk to you now about housing. The eviction moratorium is in place. It's going to be in place until May. But while the eviction moratorium is in place, we still have our families who are struggling. Many families, the parents are still not back to work, and the arrears continue to build up. Um, at the end of March, if housing court reopens, so many families are going to be facing eviction. As city council member, what would be your plan to help these families? What other programs, in addition to say the one-shot deal, would you push for and advocate for? How can we help these families who are going to be in the thousands behind on their rent?
Yeah. So I think it really is a matter of investment and a matter of developing revenue. And again, going to what I said at the beginning of this is that it's really necessary for elected officials and candidates to be transparent about what is possible within our particular offices and what limitations are there. And so lots of this revenue development that can actually happen on the state level. And so you think about things like taxing the rich, for instance, taxing the 1%. That is a way to have an influx of funds and revenue that can start to invest back what that rent looks like and what mortgages. I also think about when we talk about rent relief and canceling rent in general, the impact that has on small landlords, right? Like it's not just, especially in New York, and in District 15, we have a lot of small landlords who live in 2 to 3 family homes, and they're actually able to, they've been suffering significantly from the cancellation of rent that is necessary for tenants' rights and tenant protection, but also their mortgages are still due. And ultimately, the banks are private, and therefore they're still going to have to owe banks something. So there needs to be a bailout. There needs to be a bailout revenue developing program here. And that does happen on a state level as far as being able to, for instance, taxing the rich. But what we can do in city council is, again, leaning back into those public, like the public information campaigns and teaching folks about what programs already exist as far as access to public housing. I think through the voucher system that exists currently, both for our shelter system as well as for public housing, and looking at not only expanding those, like making more of them available, but also increasing the amount that is offered within those vouchers. Like we have to make sure that our housing programs are actually how would I describe this? A market rate. Like they're actually fairly allocated so that people can have not only the access to housing, but the access to sustained and dignified housing. And that also has to be, that can be done through revamping the voucher system and the voucher program and what that looks like. One thing that can also really be transformational for what affordable housing looks like in New York, and specifically the Bronx and District 15, is taking a look at the AMI and how the average median income is actually how we determine what public housing is and what the market rate for public housing is. So AMI is the average median income that all of New York City, including Suffolk County, and Nassau County, I believe too, the average median income of all of these boroughs, all of these very differently leveled socioeconomic areas are clumped together, and then that average is how we actually determine the market rate for affordable housing. And what is often said, especially to the Bronxites, is that, well, we don't do the average, we reduce it by 30%, right? That's what we get from the mayor often. But when you look at those numbers, you have 1-bedroom apartments that are quote unquote affordable in New York that are set at a rate of needing, you need $60,000 salaries. That is not the average median of a Bronxite, and it's definitely not an average median salary for District 15. District 15, the average median salary is about $27K, and that is changing quickly as the unemployed rate continues to grow. And because of this, we really need to take a look at how our determining factor of rate and affordability is really determined in the Bronx and really determined across New York City. There's no reason that our income levels should be attached to the Upper East Side. When we don't have Upper East Side resources, we don't get Upper East Side access to school programming, we don't get Upper East Side access to housing. We don't get any of the same standards. So we need to make sure that we're meeting people where they're at, again, where their salary bands are actually, and we could do that by tackling the AMI.
Why do you think elected officials haven't addressed this issue with the AMI? Why do they continue to lump, for example, the Bronx with Westchester, or with Suffolk County or Nassau County? Why hasn't this been addressed?
I mean, it's political courage, right? I think some of it is political courage. It's this interest of it is this interest in not wanting to necessarily tackle what I would argue is the beast of reform and systemic change in all of New York City. I think housing and really shifting towards this ideology of housing and being a human right is a big part of where the disconnect here. Tackling the AMI means taking a real look at access, taking a real look at economic mobility and economic opportunities that are not the same. So we have this concept in New York specifically of a tale of two cities. But I would argue that it's a tale of about 20 probably, where it's very different. It's very different. We don't have this idea of just poor and rich. There's lots in between. And a lot of it is connected to gerrymandering. A lot of it is connected to access. It's connected to the segregation that definitely happens based on where people are pushed, either through being unhoused, unemployed, and what access of housing could look like. And when we take a look at AMI, it is a moment of really looking in the mirror and having that true conversation of like, we don't treat people the same. And I think that's part of the political courage that is missing. The reason that I think you cannot start to treat New York City as a holistic system if everybody doesn't have access to the same opportunities, to the same systems, and to the same way of navigating and building a sustained, dignified life. That's everything from employment to schooling to whether or not they have access to affordable housing that is dignified, right? And so I think that's a big part of it. I'm sure, if we sat down with some other elected officials, they'd say some other things, but I think it comes down to courage, genuine reflection of what people are deserving of. And that is a big core aspect of my campaign and my politic and how I approach community organizing is we deserve so much more. And the Bronx definitely deserves so much more. And we don't see it. We don't see it in investment, and we don't see it in the way that people are choosing to ignore things like the potential of tackling the AMI.
Okay. So I want to talk about housing, the situation. Just when it comes to vouchers, I don't know if you saw the article in the New York Times. They actually did a story on a family in the shelter system. Just also now touching back on this AMI issue, but the family had the City FEPS voucher, as do many families in the shelter system. And the City FEPS voucher is supposed to help them and cover the cost for an apartment. But there are two problems with that. At the very least, two problems with that. One, the amount for the voucher is much less. It's just not enough to pay for rent. For example, even in District 15, if a family has a voucher for, say, a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom apartment, if you look at the rents in your district, that voucher is not enough money. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you have landlords, realtors, management companies who are practicing income discrimination and are refusing to accept the voucher. So my question to you is this: as City Councilwoman, what would you do? How would you advocate for these families, so many homeless families in shelters who cannot get out of the shelter because of this income discrimination, and also because of the low, ridiculous amount for that's covered under the City FEPS voucher?
Yeah, that is a great and unfortunate question, I think, that you have to even ask. I think it's a testament to again, going back to housing is a human right, and our systems and our government choices and our allocation of vouchers and how inadequate they are a demonstration that that's not happening. We're not treating it as such, and so it's not actually being it's not reflective of that value, and therefore we're seeing it become inadequate or be more and more inadequate, especially as the voucher amount stays the same as the years of inflation continue to grow. And so you're seeing the market rate when we look at what rent costs or what landlords or real estate agencies, whatever they may be, are saying the rent is for these particular units in the district, but then you're not having the voucher adjusted. And so I think there's a couple of things there, again, increasing what the value of, and I believe there's legislation already in motion, intro 146. It's so many of these that you have to remember, but I think that's what it is for raising the value of what the vouchers are. I think another part of this is really holding accountable the promises that have already been made. And so, for instance, one of the things that has been implemented or that needs to be implemented and has already been promised but hasn't been rolled out is we have units, 20,000 units of social housing that is supposed to be happening, and they're just not. They haven't been rolled out, and because of this, we're not able to actually utilize something that people have fought for, that they want, but it's not an option. I had mentioned earlier, thinking through like the housing that exists, or getting creative with the land and the units that we have, similar to what I described with vaccine rollouts and how we can actually be doing them in different areas. I look to the guidance of folks like the homeless hero, Shams DeBaron, who actually we've been working together a lot, thinking through what housing and homeless advocacy could look like in the Bronx. He's was a resident and grew up in the Lambert houses, which are right in District 15, and actually working with folks like that who are homeless advocates, as well as just coalitions and groups that are looking to make sure that folks don't just have access to immediate housing, but that there's pipelines and pathways to permanent housing, and actually getting us to a place of advocating for more dignified housing. Right now, we're in this place of trying to scramble for access to shelters, for access to something temporary, and we really need to be moving forward and really pushing to what permanent housing could look like in the Bronx. And I think about both in the immediate and long term, what like other buildings and other land use could be. And land use specifically is something that's very unique to city council. You can actually really advocate for and push for what infrastructure can look like in our districts based on what we can be building and what we can be utilizing. And so an example of some immediate housing, recognizing that we're in the middle of the pandemic and how we can actually be increasing the access to a shelter system would be, for instance, like the Lambert Hotel that is on the Upper Side, that has been converted to a temporary shelter system. And so we have locations like that throughout the Bronx that you can actually be able to utilize. And I think another aspect of this really is the discrimination that happens around or the income discrimination that happens with vouchers needs to be brought to the New York City Commission on Human Rights. It needs to be reported, and there needs to be a push for more legal representation for folks with vouchers, for folks who are navigating the housing system in New York. I'm a big proponent for the access to counsel and the right for that, because I think there's so much gatekeeping and so much confusion around how to navigate these systems, how to apply, how to qualify, to know what your housing rights currently are. And by increasing the access to legal counsel, it actually will help to do that informing and public education that is needed around how we navigate, and can help people get access to the things that they need and are possible right now in the immediate. And so I think there's, short-term ways to navigate this, as well as long-term when we look at social housing and we look at what housing in general could be looking like throughout the district.
Okay. So I want to also talk about the what I call, I guess, the elephant in the room, or the housing elephant in the room, which is NYCHA.
Mm,
Again, we know the stories, we hear the stories, we see the news articles, we see the TV coverage of what's going on, what families in NYCHA are enduring year after year. Lead apartments, broken elevators, dilapidated apartments, mold, you name it, vermin infestations, it's all NYCHA. And many elected officials, their response when hearing about what's happening to our families in NYCHA is, oh, there's nothing we can do. It's the federal government. We need more money. We need more federal funding. But these residents are not living in the federal government housing authority. They are living in the New York City housing authority. These senior citizens who can't get to doctor's appointments, the senior citizen that died because the elevator wasn't working, even though she made over 17 calls to NYCHA about that elevator, are living in the New York City Housing Authority. The children, the students who are dealing with lead poisoning, um, who are going to have struggles for the rest of their lives, they living in the New York City Housing Authority. So my question to you is, what are you going to do about NYCHA? How are you going to hold the city, not the federal government, but the city accountable for the fact that our senior citizens and our families do not have heat and hot water, and our children are being poisoned by lead? How are you as a city council member going to advocate for NYCHA families in your district and throughout the city?
yeah, I really appreciate this question, especially the distinction that you laid out around, yes, NYCHA unfortunately is in the budgetary discretion of the federal government, but you're completely right. Folks who are navigating the NYCHA system, our NYCHA residents, are right here in the heart of the Bronx. They're right here in District 15, and we owe, on a city level and from a community level too, owe individuals accountability and pushing of not only the federal government, but like reimagining what we can actually do on a city level. So I think, yes, there are limitations as far as who is actually funding NYCHA, what is actually possible as far as, and I will say that the revamp that many folks talk about is sort of like an uphaul of the entire system. And it doesn't get down to the minute of what you're describing. So there's a couple of things with NYCHA that I think are really possible on a city level and can be in relationship to federal, but it can actually occur. And so I think it's really important that that we decommodify housing and support a city level homes guarantee campaign. And so that's something that has a model and a structure and a budgetary reform that exists on a federal level, but it is possible to introduce legislation and city accountability campaigning under the homes guarantee movement that has really been led by a lot of the grassroots organizations and nonprofits already doing this work with NYCHA residents and doing this work of landlord accountability and tenant rights teaching. They have developed a homes guarantee campaign that we can actually support and push through in city council. And this is going to be working towards preserving the existing affordable housing that we have, affordable public housing that we specifically have, and then also pushes to increase the social housing that I was describing before with those 20,000 units, like increasing that, as well as making sure that they're being implemented and people have access to it. And then another aspect of this for NYCHA is really making sure that we're working with residents of NYCHA. So I have had many conversations with residents of NYCHA, which is actually a coalition of anonymous residents who have been working to do, and they're keeping themselves anonymous for many reasons. And that is, I think, a smart organizing tactic of how they are working to push back against, for instance, the blueprint that was being pushed, this interest in increasing RAD and RAD access and what our vouchers could be looking like, and all of these things. And residents of NYCHA have been really focused on not only rethinking and organizing on a local level, like what it could look like to have NYCHA accountability, landlord accountability, repair accountability, but have also been looking to push an interest of green infrastructure within our public housing. And so those are two of the main components of what they're hoping to do, is have only 30% of their income be allocated for what these units are looking like. And they're organizing. I think, again, recognizing that a lot of the funding has to happen on a federal, or funding uphauls can happen on a federal level. There's organizing that is happening on the ground right now. Residents are organizing, residents are pushing back against the blueprint, and we see it working. The blueprint wasn't passed initially. Like it's people are doing it, and a lot of it, again, is coming from these information campaigns. Residents of NYCHA were able to self-print and create flyers and create opportunities for Zoom conversations that were happening weekly for information about what is happening with NYCHA, what is happening with public housing. And that wasn't something that was coming from NYCHA or coming from any of our city agencies that should be doing that work. It was tenants that were organizing and pushing for, hey, do you know that's happening? Do you know we're shifting towards Section 8 vouchers instead? And this is the kind of work. And so on a city level, being in relationship with these organizers, being in relationship with tenants directly. And I think one core aspect of my campaign and what I'm really hoping to bring to City Council is participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting specifically is a way to take this organic organizing and this organic collective interest that is happening with groups like residents of NYCHA to be able to move that into tangible budget reform and budget lines that are allocated and determined from collective decision making. And so it is having things like town halls, it is having actual community votes on what we can be allocating. And so I think, we start to tackle it in that way, really encourage more tenant organizing, really encourage more landlord accountability. And then what I've been doing on the campaign, and what our campaign has actually been doing, is recognizing landlord accountability has been very difficult, always. And what we've been doing is, like, we have an entire COVID relief a resource page, and we've been collecting information on the doors as folks are telling us, like, landlords are not doing something, their repairs aren't being adjusted, and we're submitting larger claims, like packets of these reports as we're engaging voters at the door, packets of reports to management too, to try to just also be an external force of what that looks like. Because oftentimes if one tenant doesn't know another tenant it's happening, and that organizing isn't already occurring, we're trying to also step in and do that during the campaign as well. And just making sure that folks know that, yes, it is on a federal level, but city-wise, there are things we can be doing. And a lot of this is just engaging residents, because residents know fully what their vision of public housing really should be and what a dignified housing access is. And so working directly with residents is of the utmost importance.
Okay. So let's talk about education, which is a whole other black hole as I describe it. So you went to school here in the Bronx.
Yep, I went to elementary and public school in the Bronx. Went to actually attended one of the specialized high schools for high school, but I've been in public education in New York City. So the New York City Department of Education has a budget of over $30 billion, and I always make sure to say B with a B, phonetically speaking, B, billion. And it's one of the agencies, I think it's only second to the police departments when it comes to the amount of money. But when it comes to the educational outcomes of our children, and I'm just going to speak for the Bronx is always 62 each and every year. Not, every few years. It's something that's been happening for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
the Bronx is number 62. The Bronx always has the lowest proficiency rates when it comes to ELA and math, when it comes to the, science, social studies, the Bronx is 62. When it comes to Regents exams, you name it, the Bronx is 62. So my question is this: how do you, as a city council member, and being there in District 15 yourself, a product of the New York City public schools, how do you plan on holding the Department of Education accountable for the educational outcomes of our children in K through 12? Higher education is a different story, but we're gonna touch on that. But first, I want to know, what are you going to do to try to hold them accountable for that $30 billion budget?
Yeah, I really appreciate the emphasis on the B there. It is a large sum that has clearly been allocated and clearly been utilized incorrectly and not been been utilized in a way that our resources and the access to the academic, the social, and the emotional and mental health services that our students need, they haven't been utilized to build holistic Bronxite students. And I think that is a testament to what you're describing around us being 62, always falling at 62, and falling short for the both standards, expectations, and sustainability of what education looks like. And so we're a big part of what needs to happen with education across, especially with this $30 billion budget for city council, and like looking at what needs to happen for students in the middle of COVID and in the middle of a very clear digital gap that is occurring, and then the sustainability of what programming should look like. And so I'd like to answer this in two parts, specifically first with recognizing what's happening with remote learning right now, and specifically what's happening with the technological gap that could have been avoided if we were making sure to invest in how our education systems were actually going, and recognizing that as technology advances, access to technology, especially in public schools in New York, should have also been advancing predating COVID. It should not have been an emergency response. Students and families should have been receiving Chromebooks, I believe is what they use, Chromebooks. They should have been receiving Chromebooks, access to internet. There should have been a push for universal broadband way before COVID happened. And I like to also really talk about things in the midst of COVID and what the systems look like, and then also talk about how they existed before, and what we need to be how we need to be moving them forward. And so COVID has caused a lot of problems in our community. But it really has just exacerbated and showed us the lack of safety nets and the lack of actual investment. And we see that in education. Remote learning is not working specifically for Black, brown, working class, marginalized communities. We are seeing it not only in the grades and in the stats that are coming out, but also in the allocation of resources, in the access to internet and technology that they're receiving. And then I also look at District 15 being, I believe we're second, I want to say, we're second for the most amount of students being in temporary housing, right? And so we really need to be being in temporary housing. So we need to really be looking at, in the immediate, making sure that we're playing adequate catch up. The Department of Education has done a terrible job of not only advocating for students and families for what they needed before COVID, but this rollout of technology and this inadequate rollout of technology and access to internet has disproportionately impacted residents and families in District 15 because of the demographic breakdown and the economic access and the fiscal access or lack thereof that folks in this community have. If we're second for families being in temporary housing, then that means there needs to be universal broadband and free internet at homeless shelters, at housing units that are part of the shelter system, or part of our placement for housing. We need to have access to that. And appliances are needed. You can't do remote learning if you have 3 children at home and there's 1 computer that is given to a family. That is not fair. We're setting folks up for failure. And there needs to be that $30 billion budget needs to be moving with not only the times of what's needed as far as the technological gap as well as internet access, but also needs to be diversified for building the Bronx student who's actually going to be able to move in this world successfully. And that is not just academic standards, but we've seen with data across the board educationally that if you have access, students have access to varied learning. They have access to varied programming, robotics, arts and sciences. The middle school I went to, I learned how to play the saxophone and clarinet. I got access to music and my math grade significantly increased. Right. And that is, those 2 things are directly connected. I was struggling in math and had really, hadn't had a grasp on it. And I fully understood fractions by being taught music, right? Like there's a varied aspect of learning and access to information and experience that we owe our students, and we owe them this. And what happens so often that, yes, there's a $30 billion budget, but so often we see the defunding of education happen. We see the cutting of services. We see, we need things like universal after school that will help so much with the working class, especially essential workers that have been saving us during this pandemic. I think of the single parent households, and by not having access to childcare, not having access to after school that's embedded within the education budget, it is having an astronomical effect on not only grades of the students, but the mental health, the emotional health, and the stability of family units within our district. And it's all connected to a lack of bold commitment to education and information access and experience access and skill development that needs to happen across the Bronx. And so with COVID, we need to do more with this rollout of technology and with technology and internet. I also think about like long term when we think through budget cuts, and I'll connect education to transit because I've done a lot of transit work and transit advocacy work. We find that folks really are comfortable, elected officials are really comfortable cutting education services and cutting access to transit, 2 things that are necessary and so intricate to the way that New Yorkers can function in our city and in our communities. And that willingness to cut those things also shows a lack of value on developing, again, experiences and access for our children who are our future. And then also the ability to move around the city. These 2 things, it's not a coincidence that they're often cut because they don't impact a certain percentage of New Yorkers in the same way, or particular neighborhoods that have access and never have to really worry about how they're going to pay for these music access, robotics, after school programming. My mom was part of the PTA growing up, and I just remember bake sale after bake sale after bake sale. And as somebody who's worked in economic justice since then, it makes me question, why was there a need for so many of them to get scraps to hold on to like one aspect of a program? Why isn't there universal funding and working with nonprofit organizations and service provider and program provider organizations within the borough and within the city that can lean in and teach dance and teach music and do all these things to help supplement the access and the academic experience for students. So there's so much that can be done with this $30 billion budget, and it really starts around making sure that we're valuing education and also expanding what educational campuses look like. So I am on the associate board of WEDCO, and I really look to their community campuses as an example as to what we can actually be doing when it comes to education and housing and healthcare. It really shows that if you have campuses that are really dedicated to having more services that are needed to create an ease of access and a level of trust and feasibility for our communities to actually utilize, we can do things like make sure that Flu shots are given. That's something that WEDCO has done often. Flu shots are given on site for families and students, and that creates a level of stability. Someone doesn't have to be absent from school. And this, it's just a holistic way of treating education as one pillar of what is an essential aspect of our communities.
Okay. You mentioned that you attended a specialized high school. Um, right now, there is a lot of contention over what people call the lack of diversity in the specialized high schools. For our viewers who are unfamiliar with the specialized high schools, uh, you know, the specialized high schools in New York City, majority of them have a very, very low amount of Black and Hispanic students. The majority of our specialized high schools are Asian and white. And there's a lot of controversy over this situation. And full disclosure, my daughter, my 22-year-old recent college graduate daughter, attended a specialized high school. Now, with the specialized high schools were the Specialized High School Act, called the Heck-Calendra Act, covers 4 specialized high schools under the Heck-Calendra state law that opponents of specialized high schools want changed so that they could diversify the specialized high schools. Those 4 high schools are LaGuardia High School, Bronx Science, Brooklyn Tech, and Stuyvesant High School. The additional specialized high schools that New York City has were created by former Mayor Bloomberg when he took control of the New York City public school system under mayoral control. Now, there are parents who are for the specialized high school exams. The argument, Ms. Gopal, is that the specialized high schools are, less than 10%, less than 5% of New York City high schools. We should focus on the over 95%, maybe even 98% of New York City high schools that are failing to properly educate our children. Hence, a lot of our kids, when they go on to college, they have to take remedial courses. Even when they go to CUNY, the majority of high school graduates end up having to take remedial courses. So my question to you is this. What is your position on this specialized high school debate? Would you support the creation of more specialized high schools, which this mayor could do at any point in time if he chose to? There's nothing keeping him from creating more specialized high schools. What is your position on this? And as a graduate of specialized high schools, how would you find this middle ground? Because, and I just want to speak, I can speak for myself. I have 2 children. I have a 22-year-old, I have a 12-year-old. Different children, different learning styles. My daughter was a level 4, the top student all throughout school. My son, math is his favorite subject. Does excellent with math, I'll just say that. He loves math, don't give him reading. But children are different. And some children need that challenge because we don't want them to get bored. So as a graduate, you went through the system, you attended a specialized high school. What do you see as the middle ground if you were a council member? What would you advocate for? What solutions or compromises would you put forth to parents on both sides?
Yeah, no, I appreciate this, and I appreciate your personal analysis of your children. It reminds me so much of my brother and I. My brother and I are a year apart. And so we went to the same elementary school and we went to the same middle school. And in high school in New York City, I feel like, especially for immigrant families, which mine is, my mother, speaks an English dialect of patois. But so is able to navigate aspects of the education system from having access to English, but there's a lot of cultural translations that need to be happen. What, like, this confusion of what getting zoned is and why you don't want that to happen. Do we need to all of a sudden get thousands of dollars to send? Of course, I went first. I'm a year older than my brother. Should we be taking all of our savings and sending her to Catholic school? Like, what is the specialized high school process? There was a lot of what I would argue translation that had to happen around how do you even navigate the beast that is the high school process in New York. And that in itself is problematic, right? It is not easy. It is purposefully gate kept. There's lots of confusion. And I'll tell you the story of how I ended up at a specialized high school. And it's a testament to some of the things I hope to also push into what that middle ground could look like. So I was able to, in the 7th grade, one of my middle school teachers told me about, at that point, it was called the DREAM program. And so essentially, yeah, it was the DREAM program. And it was for students who were quote unquote gifted and talented. And I would argue that every student in New York and every student in the country is gifted and talented if their gifts and talents are invested in, if their particular learning style is invested in, and there is an interest to meet them where they're at, instead of, like you said with your son, meet like math, cultivate that, really lean into that, and think through what the learning styles could be. So I was able to attend, which is extensive, a year and a half long, including an entire summer of programming that was dedicated to just taking the specialized high school test. In retrospect, it was the only reason I made it. It was the only reason I was actually able to pass that test and get into, I attended Stuyvesant High School. And so this concept of even having to qualify for a program. And the only reason I was able to qualify was, again, I fell into the gifted and talented, right? And had level 4s, but also it was targeted in more impoverished, lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods with schools that were failing or struggling that had been determined. So it was a particular program that I fit into a niche, right? And so I had access to this program that taught me how to do the test that was free. I didn't have to pay for it. And I actually was able to take the test and get in. That is a program that for those particular parameters are actually so unfortunate when you think about it. I slipped through the cracks of having access to the education that I did at Stuyvesant and the diversified academic experience that I had at a specialized high school, which I think honestly everyone deserves. And our zip codes too often determine what our not only education access is, but ultimately our economic opportunities are, because education in this country specifically is so intertwined with what our eventual success could look like, right? There's at least clear pipelines of that. And especially coming from an immigrant family, that's embedded in us. Like, you go to school, you get as many degrees as possible. And like, that's how you're going to become successful, right? And so with the specialized high school, the specialized high school infrastructure and system, I think ultimately ends up failing us because it doesn't, as a city and as whole, because what it does is it creates a layer of elitism, and it creates a layer of limited access to people who may not qualify for that niche program that I was describing, or don't have the funds to actually pay for intensive prep, like similar to SAT prep, which for folks who don't know, if you are taking the SAT to get into college, it is very similar. It's a specialized high school SAT essentially that you're taking. So if there are families that spend so much money on programming that is specifically oriented to taking this test. The idea that it's only a test to get in, to have access to this level of education, this level of access and cultivation of academic experience is where the problem really lies. The test itself and the access to the test and the ability to pass this test, there is not enough affirmative action placed on it. There's not enough diversification of how we can get into specialized high schools and students can have access to this. So one sort of medium or meeting in the middle, as you described, change that needs to happen is that it can't just be this test. because as I just described, I slipped through the cracks. I had the right teacher do the translating to my mom about why I should even be spending my Wednesdays and Saturdays for an entire year and all day, Monday to Friday, at a program just to take this exam to get into a school, maybe, right? And so I had that access, but it was exclusionary. It wasn't at all enough. And what we see actually, and this is why there needs to be a revamp of the system and access of it, is that as much as I received an education that I think was beneficial for my college acceptances and my academic experience, you do see that specifically young people of color, Black and brown folks, like you described, do not get the opportunity at all. And we see this, I believe in 2019, there was an article about 7 Black students that got accepted into Stuyvesant High School specifically, which is where I went, out of a class of almost 900 folks. That is a testament to us not doing enough work across the board, for making sure that the access and that the fairness and equitable components of how we are able to expand education and academic standards are not happening across, right? And so I think your question to should we be expanding how many specialized high schools there are, I would say yes, but I wouldn't even put it in the context of specialized high schools. I think what needs to happen is that it needs to be bolder and more actual retroactive than that. It needs to be that the high schools that currently exist can all have components of and layered academic curriculum and access and diversified experience that specialized high schools have, right? And so I think it's also this need of, yes, we can diversify and add more specialized high schools, but there also needs to be a revamp of what those experiences are and what makes them special. They need to trickle down to all high schools across, so that this concept of getting zoned, especially growing up in the Bronx in this district and thinking about what high school would look like, it was scary hearing I remember distinctly the fear that my mom had about the confusion she experienced about people telling her, both educators and community members, that like she can't go to school here, and not understanding why. And when I think about it, I spent an hour and a half one way every day taking the 2 train from West Farms all the way to Chambers Street every day. I spent close to 3 hours commuting for a high school education, which yes, was good, but it takes time. It takes a toll, mental health, emotional health, doesn't give me time for family, for other things, other development. It's very limiting. And so this idea that we have to travel around the city to find a school that provides us with an academic experience that will set us up for college is unacceptable. And there definitely should be more diversification and building out of what specialized high schools, or how many there are, but there also needs to be a revamp of specific resources that specialized high schools receive that can be given to other high schools. I think in an ideal world, what I would love is if right now our public school education budgets per district are only are allocated based on our tax brackets. Right. And so that is what's given back to us. And so what I would love to see happen is if we had a collective city public education budget that was allocated equally across the city, and then see what that looks like. That zip codes determine so much. And we see that so much in the Bronx about what that could look like. And I really just want to really emphasize that the specialized high school test is insufficient. It's also ultimately disenfranchising to Black and brown students, and doesn't take into consideration the lack thereof cultivation and access and specific training that has to happen across, and that oftentimes involve monetary commitments from families that might not be in that position. And so that shouldn't be the determining factor of whether or not you get a quote unquote good education. And so as much as I'm grateful for the education I had at Stuyvesant, I'm an anomaly. It shouldn't have happened. For so many reasons. There's so many things that could have blocked it from happening. And the fact that it's so fragile, that access, is a testament to us not doing it well enough. We definitely need to be doing more to make sure that all across, up and down, from elementary school, or even Head Start, you think about preschool, pre-K for all right now, all the way up to high school. needs to be changed. And so more than just the test, I will say more than just the test, interviews, project-based showing of like how you could actually get into some of these schools, diversifying and expanding how many specialized high schools are, and then doing a readjustment of budget allocation to high schools that already exist that are not specialized, to make sure that we are sharing sharing the access to, again, that diversified academic experience.
So I just have two more education questions for you. When you look at Hunter College High School, right? And when you look at, say, for example, Beacon or Eleanor Roosevelt, these schools are not specialized high schools, but they're also the most segregated because those schools are majority white. So my question is, how would you desegregate those schools, diversify the student bodies, as you're suggesting to diversify the student body at the current specialized high schools? And this, this is something that people always have to point out, because when you look at Hunter College High School, good luck trying to get into that school for many parents, or for their children, and you look at Beacon also, like those schools are majority white. Why is the focus on the specialized high schools, which are majority Asian, whether they're South Asian or Asian, I'll say Asia major? You know, granted, it's a very small number of Black and brown students. Those Asian students who also come from low-income families and immigrant families, they are students of color. They are families of color. And we tend to forget that, and then we tend to not pay attention to selective schools like Hunter and Beacon and others who are even more segregated along racial lines, where good luck finding the students of color, whether they're Black, brown, or Asian. So as a city council member, like, how do you propose to also ensure that those schools are diversified and that zip code doesn't matter when applying to those schools?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, the distinction there. I think we have to, and it's not at all done perfectly, and we've seen it. I think the concept is there, but it's not implemented as well as it could be and as aggressively as it could be. But I think we have to look to higher education and affirmative action plans and proposals that are occurring on a college level, both for community colleges, private colleges, whatever it may be. Affirmative action has really been pushed in that sector of education, and not at all through public education, specifically around specialized high schools and these schools that you're talking about, Beacon and Hunter, for instance. And if we were, one thing that you could do is have a particular percentage that is required, for a class, an accepting class, to be finalized before we can actually move forward with the school year. I think that is one aspect of it. And for those requirements, it should be not only Black or brown, for whether or not someone is Black or brown, for what that percentage would look like. But I think it's also really important to take into consideration and really push for a class component of that. So socioeconomic status should also be part of that. Thinking through someone being Black or brown, but from a more affluent background, or having more access, their family being in a different tax bracket, for instance, that is not negating the racial diversity that is there, but it doesn't at all have class diversity and economic diversity that is very much needed. And I think that is the big game changer, especially in New York. And when I look at the Bronx and District 15 specifically, we're predominantly Black and brown, people of color, right? But there's distinctions around access and there's distinctions around class due to fiscal opportunities that are directly connected to job access and property ownership. Those are two things that are part of it. And so when we look at what affirmative action can be like on a public school New York City level, it should be race and it should be class as well. And then I also think what needs to happen is programming that is specifically coming from the high school. If we're talking about high schools, coming from the high school level, that is working directly with elementary schools and middle schools, even pre-K, of developing not only community relationships, but having pipeline programs of not just naming a child gifted and talented and sending them through this program so that they have guaranteed, but doing programming that shows exposure, that gives that has, like, I think through events where a specialized high school could come and host like reading days, or we had band at Stuyvesant, so like they could come and do an event, and so that there's more of a understanding that specialized high schools exist and this other high school exists, and these are things that you have access to, and that you can thrive, you can be interested in having part of your achievement story, right? And so I think it's also having more coordinated relationships with high schools, specialized, or those that are more funded, because ultimately that's what Hunter and Beacon are. They're well resourced, therefore they can have more of a distinguished, they can have more of a specific, I won't say distinguished, more of a specific vetting process for how they accept students, right? Versus other high schools that are underfunded can't. Oftentimes, a lot of high schools are making decisions around acceptance rates based on funding that is needed. So they're packing in, and you see this across elementary school and middle school, but they're packing in 35 kids per classroom. Again, my partner is an elementary school teacher in the Bronx, and so has oftentimes had to have classrooms and spaces that were overpacked, all due to funding. And like, every child gets you so much funding, and this shouldn't be the case, right? We need to be revamping the ways in which schools across the board are interacting with each other, implement actual affirmative action that's reflective of not only race but class, and diversifying funding. I think when you look at, so take Stuyvesant for instance, it receives a lot of public funding, right? But a lot of the funding also happens from alumni networks, right? And so how amazing would it be if we were to really diversify public funding, really look to create high schools across the city that give you those opportunities where you can have alumni networks and robust interest in reinvesting. I think a testament to why a lot of alumni at Sty give back is because they felt a direct impact from their academic experience, that they have a buy-in to give back to it, right? And so that can happen across New York City, and it shouldn't be, the filler for funding, but I think it shows a cultural shift in how we value education and how we're actually investing in academia. And that can happen if we're actually shifting what the budget looks like, if we're implementing affirmative action programs, and we're actually creating more cross school and cross level interaction with each other. I'll say one thing about my middle school. I went to a middle school on Mapes Avenue, right here in the middle of right by the pool in District 15, and our homerooms were Ivy League. They were Ivy League colleges. So I was in Yale homeroom, right? And that seems really small and sort of silly, right? But it also starts to create in a 10-year-old's mind this idea that college is possible and it is a goal. And I think we can implement things like that throughout. And there's budgetary ways to do it. There's social ways to do it. And I think there is an interest for community to not have to necessarily be confined to the limitations of our zip codes that are really deeply rooted in racial injustice and in clear segregation that happens. And it's showing up in our schools, and we can and should be doing more.
Okay, and my final question on education is, do you support mayoral control, or what is your position on mayoral control?
Yeah, I think I believe that happened in Bloomberg's administration, I want to say.
Yes.
That in itself, I think, is a testament to the complications with it. So mayoral control, just to be honest, I think mayoral control itself doesn't allow the city council. So from a city council point of view, and from accountability of multiple elected official positions within local government doesn't allow for the checks and balances that are actually implemented to have better accountability and better representation from community input. So city council, in not having the ability to push and to have more of formalized control and how things are allocated, are actually limited in their ability to translate and to communicate what is happening on the ground with community, especially if we're implementing things like participatory budgeting, which I'm really hoping we're able to move towards. That gets stopped, and it becomes gate kept with mayoral control. And so I think there are things that the mayor, of course, has to make decisions on. But I do think that, unfortunately, with the shift towards mayoral control, it has limited the capacity and the power of city council, which, due to the districts and the specific neighborhood allocation that city council has, it ultimately limits the access that people have to those decisions, because city council, because it's more local and actually has access to community. And if elected officials are doing their jobs well and serving the public, then they're going to be in constant communication with the districts. And by having mayoral control, you've now you've kind of cut off the community from those decisions, because it doesn't even allow like an office like city council to liaison accordingly. And so I would say no.
Okay, well, this has been really, you know, a really wonderful interview with you, Ms. Gopal, especially talking about the education issues and you being a product of the New York City public school system. So I want to end with the final topic, which is NYPD, public safety, and police community relations. So you're aware of the Defund NYPD movement, but I'm sure you're also aware of the increase in crime in our communities, as well as the surge in gun violence. Now, we have 1-year-olds being shot in parks. We have teenagers being shot on the basketball court. Here in the Bronx, we also have had a 4-year-old walking in the street with her father, and her father gets shot in the head. And every single week, and I'm just going to talk just for the Bronx, there are so many stories about crime and gun violence in our communities. Now, as the mother of a Black 12-year-old young man, the safety of my son is paramount. I am a mother, but I am more, along with many other mothers and parents, we are more in fear of somebody who looks like our children, someone else who's Black and brown, robbing, stealing, killing, or shooting our children. Because this is real, this is happening in our communities. So my question to you is this. As City Council woman, what would you do? One, to improve police community relations, because if anything happens, speaking as a parent, speaking as a woman, when I call 911, I'm calling the police because I need help. And they're still, no matter what, they're still the ones that we're going to call. But how do you plan on improving police community relations, which are clearly frayed? The tensions are there, the concerns are real. But how do you plan, or how do you see yourself as, again, finding that middle ground between the concerns of community members, as well as also the concerns of parents, mothers, fathers, grandparents, looking at this surge in crime? How do we bring these two together? How would you work towards bringing these two together, as well as working on decreasing the amounts of crime and gun violence?
Yeah, I really appreciate your just your such valuable perspective as a mother, especially a mother of a Black son of the Bronx, right? And I think that is who we should be looking at, especially like who you just described your son is how we need to be, who we need to be valuing and really leaning into the betterment of his experience and also the safety of his experience within the Bronx and in New York City in general. And that is who that is exactly the type of resident that I'm thinking through of who like what reimagining safety looks like in our community. And so I think what you're describing around the the immense violence that occurs in our communities is something I've actually heard so much and have witnessed myself. Grew up in the Bronx and live in the Bronx, and understand that violence is pervasive in our communities. And we hear this as I've been campaigning. It is of the utmost importance, especially to families, of how we address what that violence looks like, reduce gun violence specifically, and also there's been a significant interest in police accountability that is community oriented and also serves the purpose of what police are supposed to be doing. And so going to that specifically is how I would be reimagining what safety looks like in our community. Oftentimes police are called for situations, like you said, you call them because you need help, but oftentimes they are called and tasked with things that feel impossible for what they are actually trained to do and what is actually needed in that moment. And so one of the aspects that I'm really determined to do is reimagine what first response looks like in the Bronx and what first response looks like in New York. And so having more of an investment in not removing police necessarily from situations, but thinking through what mental health and social services could also be called in the same vein as 911 for particular things that are occurring in our communities. And so recognizing that, yes, violence is of an utmost issue for our communities, but oftentimes police are called for situations that could be handled or de-escalated through the leaning in of the skills of mental health professionals as well as social service professionals as well. And so there needs to be a balance in our communities that don't exist right now. And then going back to what you're describing around what violence looks like in the Bronx, I've been working with and I think it's really important that the folks who are mostly impacted are at the forefront of what these solutions look like. And so I've been in communication and working with groups like the Peacemakers, which are formerly incarcerated or formal gang members who understand very intensely and very personally what violence looks like in our community, have been on the other side of creating violence in our community, and have dedicated their lives now to increasing youth services, increasing public education as to why violence is not the answer. And so working with groups like the Peacemakers has the ability to be super transformative because it's people who understand the block. It's people who understand the culture and also understand our neighborhoods in a way that they can break through the communication barriers for our youth, specifically as to why you'd be interested in turning to violence or participating in violence, whatever it may be. And so working with groups like that help us reduce gun violence, help us encourage honest and transparent conversations about what's happening in our communities, helps give youth a place to actually reflect on what's happening. I think about those coalition conversations. How amazing would it be if they translated to direct precinct relationship, right? So like if youth were able to directly be part of coalition building that's happening at precincts and be able to communicate and learn from police and have a direct relationship with police, that can also be an aspect that is really going to push us into reimagining what safety looks like. But all of this to say, it's not ignoring the fact that violence has increased honestly during COVID, right? And when you look at the violence that's been happening in the last couple of months specifically, a lot of it, when you look at the reports, a lot of it has been connected to they're like poverty oriented crimes. People are stealing food. People are and people are enacting in violent actions because they're caught up in something that is a reflection of not being invested in survival wise. Like we don't have things like youth services, after school programs, like universal after school programs, for instance. There's been a significant effort to get more funding for community centers and boys and girls clubs and places where youth and intergenerational learning can happen. And I think a big part of the violence that we see in our communities too is, again, the survival and the basic human needs like food security, housing, all these things are not present. And there's also not programming and opportunity for collective learning and collective camaraderie. And so, we have police officers who don't live in the community, who are coming from very different places, who oftentimes are not, don't have a familiar or personal relationship to predominantly Black and brown community besides being the enforcer of law here. And I think we have to move towards community policing that includes members of our own district who are actually part of the force, who are actually able to understand, again, that cultural competency and understanding of what our neighborhoods look like and how we interact with each other would be a big shift towards starting to deter that violence and reduce gun violence overall, but also create a level of community accountability. Right now, we live in such silo, and it's because there's a lack of community centers and funding for them. There's a lack of engagement with police officers that is not only when you call them. It's not only when you're actually in need, and that is the first moment you're interacting with that precinct that is in your neighborhood. And so there needs to be more of that. And one of the things that I think really shows the potential for this to be transformative and really shifting in our communities is what happened after Stop and Frisk. So once Stop and Frisk was implemented, the big campaign to eliminate Stop and Frisk, a big part of that was community coming together and really wanting to reimagine accountability relationship and specifically training of police officers, and how recognizing that there is racial discrimination within police officers, and that there isn't enough mental health and social services strategy and tactic that is implemented in how you're trained on the force. And so after Stop and Frisk, there was a push for that. And I could see expanding that and having police accountability, and also the presence of police. Both of those things can exist in silo with each other, in relationship with each other. They don't have to exist separately. So yeah, crime and violence are of the utmost importance to deal with in our communities, but I think it has to be both our relationship to police and also an investment in the things that help us move to a more stabilized community that has our survival needs taken care of. And so it has to be both of those things.
Okay. Well, Ms. Gopal, thank you so very much for sharing with our viewers and engaging our viewers and the constituents of District 15 about these issues that really and truly impact us. More so now, dealing and reeling from this COVID-19 pandemic. We will be watching your campaign closely. For our viewers, again, here's another reminder. March 23rd, please come out and vote. Make your plan if you want to do early voting, if you want to do absentee voting, get out and vote. Bring your neighbor with you to come out and vote. See if your neighbor wants an absentee ballot. Help them complete it online to get the absentee ballot. But it is very, very important that District 15 voters come out and vote. Unlike the other districts, you do not have representation right now in the City Council. It is critical, it's important that you have a voice in the City Council. And with these candidates running for District 15, we really need you to come out and make your voices heard and select the candidate that you want to help guide you through the rest of 2021. And hopefully that same candidate will be there with you come 2022. So, Ms. Gopal, as an immigrant, as a parent, let me say this, because I can. I am sure that your parents are very, very proud of you. What you've accomplished, what you're doing, this candidacy, um, and just in general, as a fellow immigrant. Um, I know that they're very, very proud because you somewhat remind me of my daughter. So I know how that feels. So I know that they are immensely, immensely proud of you. Um, we will be watching, again, we will be watching your race very closely. And, we wish you the best with your candidacy. And, come March 23rd, I know that we here at LittleAfrica BronxNews will be covering your special election to see what the results are. And also, one last thing for our viewers, not only is this election important because it is a special election, but it's also a ranked choice voting election. And ranked choice voting, LittleAfrica BronxNews will be conducting ranked choice voting trainings that we hope that voters in District 15 will come and learn more about ranked choice voting. But pretty much to sum it up, you get to rank your 5 preferred candidates: first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and fifth choice. And that's why it is really, really, really important that you get to know who these candidates are and what their policies are so that you can um, rank them accordingly. So again, Ms. Gopal, it has been a pleasure interviewing you today. Thank you for engaging our viewers. Thank you for engaging our community. And we'll see you on the campaign trail.
Thank you.
Oh, and wait, one last thing for our viewers. At the end of this video, there will be a slide with Ms. Gopal's website as well as her social media handles. And I forgot one last thing, Ms. Gopal. Please just give us your closing remarks and why voters should vote for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I will say why voters should vote for me is that I have been doing accountability work in community organizing for years. I've been on the side of winning things like fair fares, winning things like a better bus plan, $15 minimum wage. This is work that I've done in the community on both a national and local level. And I've pushed elected officials to be in better accountability relationship with community. And I promise to bring that to city council. I promise to move in coalition building and move in grassroots organizing, because I think that is where we really learn directly from community what is needed and how we can implement it. And also, city council and the budget are going to be the determining factor of the immediate and long-term future of the Bronx. And so you're gonna want someone who is in direct relationship with community and knows how to build those relationships and will actually listen and fight for things like participatory budgeting, things that we've deserved for a very long time, but we haven't had. We deserve more is the core of my campaign and the core of all the work that I've been doing for fighting for economic justice, racial justice, gender justice on a national and local level. And I will be sure to do that in city council. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to build relationships. We've been knocking doors and phone banking and texting and just doing that voter engagement that Bronxites deserve and don't get enough of. And I'm determined to bring those strategies and learned experience from working on a presidential campaign to the community work that I've done to the Bronx. And so I'm very excited. And I will just say one thing about ranked choice voting. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for Bronxites to really lean into their niches of their politic and how they actually want to be in relationship with government. It allows us to not just choose one person, but really push everyone who's running to lean into what our wants are. And that is radical and amazing, and really hoping that folks are able to utilize it for the special election on March 23rd.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, Ms. Gopal, and we will see you on the campaign trail.